Thank you, Rabbi Elyse, for joining us for this conversation about the Scroll of Esther and Purim. I would love if you could introduce yourself and share a little about yourself to anybody who may be watching online or with us at the Baptist Church of Westchester.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks so much, Reverend Evan. It's really my pleasure to send you all greetings from Colorado, where I am right now. And just to say that your church is very dear to me for many years because of our friends, Reverend Jim Olson and Arden Olson and Rachel and their whole family, who remain very dear friends of ours, even from very far away. So hello, everybody. And I know some people from the church still. And let's see. So just about me, I've lived in Westchester for close to 30 years now. And I am a second career rabbi and started a small congregation in Westchester, which I retired from just this past year in the pandemic. And I guess the sort of people often ask what branch of Judaism. I call myself post-denominational or just Jewish. It's probably easy to understand. And yeah, so happy to come and talk with you about Esther and about Purim. Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So we've been looking at Esther for several weeks now. What is your relationship to the Scroll of Esther, and how have you found it to be significant?
Esther is one of the 5 scrolls that we have that are part of the Hebrew Bible. It's one of only 2 books that are named for a woman, and we might say stars a woman. She's the top of the cast list, maybe. I guess my first experience of the Scroll of Esther, what we call Megillat Esther in Hebrew, is growing up and going to synagogue and hearing the Megillah of Esther read on the holiday of Purim. It is a very raucous affair because Purim, which is the holiday that emerges from the book of Esther, is sort of like Halloween and Mardi Gras and all kinds of, and New Year's Eve, basically all rolled into one. I mean, it's a crazy holiday. People dress up in costumes. People make lots of loud noises. People sometimes drink to excess, because there's a phrase in the Talmud that says that on Purim, that one should alter themselves, A-L-T-E-R, not A-L-T-A-R, themselves to such a degree they can't tell who the bad guy is, Haman, from the good guy, Mordecai. Okay. So for some people, that means, they have a bunch of shots. But when we hear the Megillah read, every time the name of Haman or Haman is said, we have like these loud noisemakers, like fire engine groggers and all kinds of, and it's just crazy. It's like everything that you could just imagine. Like, just imagine being in church and like interrupting the worship and basically like throwing tomatoes and things like that. Like, we don't throw tomatoes, but it's just, it's only once a year too, so it is, the book of Esther is it's a crazy story, and the holiday is a crazy holiday. And it also has a lot of deep meaning, which when I was a little kid, I just thought it was fun. It was very heteronormative. All the girls dressed up like Esther in the beauty contest, and all the boys dressed up as Mordecai. Occasionally somebody dressed up as Ahasuerus. And there would be beauty contests, and the carnival, and it was just great as a kid growing up. Yeah.
That's fascinating. As I was first interacting with Esther, in my background, it's, maybe a Sunday school lesson once every couple of years, and then
right,
like a VeggieTales movie, which was,
Sure.
to it.
One night with the king, right?
Yeah, right. And it wasn't until, much later that I actually kind of read the whole thing and realized that it's hilarious. It's full of all these dramatic turns and changes. I mean, laughing out loud while reading the scripture, at least when I was growing up, was not really something that I anticipated. And then as you get
Sure.
into, Esther, it's fantastic. One of the questions, as we've asked the congregation that gives some feedback, is about this type of literature that Esther is.
Mhm.
What is this scroll?
Yeah. Yeah. It's just such a great question. I think it's just important to say, it's not a history book. And, there have been attempts to place these events in the history of Persia, where the events supposedly take place. And it's ahistorical, or it's not historical. Um, it really more resembles sort of like court hijinks literature that we see in the Middle Ages in England and things like that. And maybe some of the stories that we read in Chaucer, like in the Canterbury Tales, if you were an English major like me, just crazy, crazy stuff. And just even if you just read the first chapter, I mean, the king is such a fop. He's such a fool, right? Ahasuerus, he, first of all, like points if you can even pronounce that. But it says he's like the most powerful guy in the whole wide world, but he's a total ding dong, right? I mean, he's set up like a fool, right? And he's totally controlled by his underlings, and he's very impulsive, right? And so we don't really see it as historical, but it's still very important, even though it's funny and hysterical, and it's kind of good to laugh at scripture from time to time because there's a lot to cry about, right? I guess from a sort of, now we get past like it's not historical and it's very funny. You know, for a book of the Bible to completely take place outside of the land of Israel, it's very unusual. And also the explicit there are no explicit names of God in the whole book. Okay, so like our ancient rabbis, I'm talking about the rabbis who lived like 2,000 years ago. uh they like made a lot of this, like, where's God? God maybe is hidden in this book, and Esther's name actually means hidden in Hebrew. um so, is that where God is hidden? Okay. And again, outside of the land. And so, perhaps this is the first example of how do Jews survive in diaspora? How do Jews survive when they're a minority culture? And you see how Haman and the people who turn against the Jewish population of Persia, they use these anti-Jewish tropes that we still hear today, right? There's these people that live amongst us, they're not really like us, and if bad stuff happens, they could align with our enemy. It's like that we hear that going back to, like, in the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus, that Pharaoh's underlings say that to Pharaoh, right? So we've heard this before and we still hear this. So even though it's a funny book and it's a historical, there's a lot that comes to teach us.
Absolutely. As we think about the intricacies of the book and questions that come out of it, there is so much hidden and mysterious and interesting, and I think gives us so much space to reflect and think about what that might mean in our context. Can you share a little bit about the Jewish understanding of Queen Vashti? She's a pretty mysterious character. Is she a character that is maybe pitied or someone to emulate, or a villain? She kind of is the first to stand against this foolish king.
Right. Yeah. Well,
Understood.
so I guess what I would say is all of the above. Okay, so if we go back to, the sort of most ancient writings about Vashti in what we call Midrash, which is like early rabbinic analysis of the text, Vashti's mostly seen as a really villainous person. And it kind of makes sense because she's aligned with, this gigantic empire. And as time goes on, there is more evolution of seeing Vashti, in current thinking as a sort of proto-feminist, right? And if you just look at the plain text, which truthfully I don't know what translation of Esther you've been looking at, but I just have up on my screen here now the JPS, Jewish Publication Society 1985 translation with the Hebrew, because you might say to yourself, it's the first chapter, right? We're around chapter 1, verse 10. The king and the queen have been having this weeks long party. I mean, like, that's another thing. The king, he's the most powerful guy in the world. All he does is party. And so, there's a party for the men and there's a party for the women. And then the king says, I don't know what your translation says, but this says, on the seventh day, when the king was merry with wine, he ordered his underlings, the 7 eunuchs, to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing a royal diadem to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was a beautiful woman. Okay. You would look at that and you say, okay, that seems like such a not big deal. Like, why does she say no, right? But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command. Okay. Like, why would she say no? We ask this question, and the ancient rabbis ask this question too. And they say to us, it's right there in the text, the reason. Because she is going to be objectified in front of all these drunk men. And what is she wearing? She's just wearing her crown. It doesn't say like wearing a crown and attired in beautiful robes and gowns and everything. The implication being she's asked to parade naked before men who have been drinking for days and days and days. So, even if you were part of this society near the top, that might not really feel like the safest thing to do. And she says no. Okay. So, even though she's aligned with that society, which was seen as, not the best, her action brings everything about that happens after. But the whole thing about the crown and nothing else, I think, is a really important thing to bring out. And, it's not clear if she gets banished or she gets put to death, but we don't see her again after this. And like I said, nowadays, she's really lifted up as some kind of proto-feminist. And I think appropriately.
Fantastic. Thank you. So you've shared a little bit about the Purim holiday and what it's like and your experience as a child. What makes it so meaningful beyond the joy, but also what is it about this holiday that is impactful?
Yeah. So, around different Jewish holidays, there are different traditions, and there's also different mitzvot, different commandments that we're supposed to do. And one of them I already talked about, which is hearing the scroll read. Okay. And the others have to do actually with giving gifts. That you send little gifts of, food to your friends. There's very traditional kind of cookies called hamantashen that are like shaped like a triangle, and they're filled in the middle traditionally with like prune or poppy seed, or now people put like Nutella, different kind of things in them. At hamantashen, that just means in German or in Yiddish like Haman's hats, which were triangular, which is sort of weird because in medieval Europe, Jews in many communities were forced to wear either a Jewish star on their clothes. This was way before the Nazis, who did that too, or they would have to wear like a triangular shaped hat to identify them as Jews. And so it's funny that Haman has a hat that's triangular, okay? But it's totally, there's nothing in the story that says, oh, Haman wore a funny hat. People also more commonly now see the triangular shape with the filling as like more of like a womb. Um, um, so we make hamantaschen. It's a lot of fun, and you give them to your friends. And the other thing that you do is you give money or food to feed the poor. Those are the main mitzvot, the main commandments of this holiday. So those, I would say, are still quite meaningful. And it's funny to think about like how much I loved all that raucous noise when I was a child of going to synagogue on Purim and everything. Now I find it almost insufferable. It's just, you know, but it is very much, that part of it is very much like, the children's service part of the holiday, which it's so important for kids to really have that crazy enjoyment, I think, in worship. um it's just not so much for me anymore. But the other things are really fun. And for lots of people, making hamantaschen with their mother or their grandmother is part of like their growing up. We didn't do that too much, but we did. And I did that with my kids, and with my congregation. There's a lot of, I guess I would say, multisensory aspects of this holiday. Yeah.
I love the reading of the scroll in one setting and getting that kind of whole story together. And I think we're often missing that of maybe just looking at texts and bits and pieces and
Sure. Yeah.
this corner, rather than absorbing the whole piece of literature with all of the contours.
Yeah. And what I would say about that is that, when I was growing up in a conservative synagogue, they read it in Hebrew. And, most of the people there didn't really understand. They would like follow along in the book that had it in English. In many, many synagogues now, there would be like Hebrew and English. So people actually know what is going on. And, just sort of anticipating a question that's coming up, there's some of the more difficult chapters that are not rated PG or G. Those often will still just, for when the kids are there, those parts will just be read in Hebrew and quickly, and we'll just move right through those parts that we don't really want to get into with the kids.
Yeah. Well, that does take us to this next question, especially towards the end of the book, right? The tables have turned, and we have this edict now that the Jewish people are able to defend themselves against the attackers, and we have descriptions of kind of multi-day violence and huge death tolls. What do you make of those passages?
Yeah. Again, just remembering that it's ahistorical, and that it's this sort of genre of historical literature, I guess I would say. Not hysterical, that's a bad word. Like jokey kind of. I think it all has to do with revenge fantasy, right? I mean, the first issue is like, how is it, like, why are Jews living in Persia anyway? Okay, so the Jews are living in Persia because when the first temple was destroyed, the Jews were put into exile. And it was, the land of Israel was overtaken by the Persians, and so Jewish people were living everywhere. They were living in Persia. And this part is historical. I'll just say it's a diversion away from the book. When King Cyrus of Persia took over, he allowed people to return to their native lands. So, it wasn't only the land of Israel that was conquered by those armies. There's lots of other nations too. And not everybody went back to the land of Israel. Okay, so since this is ahistorical, we don't know if this was in the time where the Jewish people were not allowed to be in their own land, or if it's the people that stayed. And the people who stayed were mostly the people who like had a good life in Persia. That kind of makes sense. But the whole part at the end with, there was this edict, and it was like, it's amazing, right? How easy was it for Haman to get this edict like from the king? Oh yeah, we can kill all the Jews, no problem. They send it out far and wide, and then it's like, well, there was that edict, we can't really undo it, but you can defend yourselves, okay? And that's kind of different for a people that has been subjugated and put in exile, right? Like, for Jews to have that kind of power is like very unusual, right? And so my best way of understanding that whole thing is as a revenge fantasy, okay? You know, there's this little joke about like all Jewish holidays that like you can sum up pretty much every Jewish holiday in like 2 sentences, 3 sentences. They tried to kill us, they couldn't, let's eat. Okay. So, if that's like the ethos of how you think about, the cycle of Jewish time, then, having a revenge fantasy every once in a while, I think is some kind of psychological release. But again, it's ahistorical. Is there any like record or any kind of evidence that this actually happened? No. So I think that's the best way for me to understand it. And of course, it makes perfect sense that we leave those parts out for the children.
Right. Helpful. While you are in Colorado at the moment, you'll be back home in Westchester soon, and you know our community really well. And I'll just say I'm really grateful that we can have this conversation. That as we're
Yeah.
planning a study of Esther, didn't really anticipate that it would lead to a relationship like this, and I'm really grateful. As we have this conversation as neighbors that share a particular community together, how does it inform how you think about our current time?
Well, I guess what I would say is, the safety and security of Jewish people in America and, in our town and just, well, in America in general, feels not as safe and secure as when I was a child in the 1960s. Big increases in anti-Jewish actions, words. Just we had the end of the Tree of Life murder trial just recently. So I think the whole sort of paranoia of being a super minority culture, super minority culture, 2% or less, is, that doesn't go away. And I think we're in an uptick of anxiety about that, like based on reality, not based on fantasy, like this story kind of is. So it's a little bit negative. What I would say is that the things that are positive are that, a Baptist minister and a Jewish rabbi who's a woman, like we are, in a relationship of trust and caring and dialogue. That's a thing that might not have been possible just even a few decades ago. So I'm very grateful for that. This sort of undertow of Jew hatred and white supremacy that we're experiencing is terrifying, actually.
Yeah, as we can describe it, Esther as ahistorical in the details, but I think in the fear that it was speaking to.
Oh, completely. Yeah.
And another a congregant sent a question in as well about growing up and having a close Jewish friend, and then kind of having this realization in a conversation that their friend was not able to join the Westchester Country Club because they were a Jew, and that was just kind of eye-opening moment. And was this congregant was asking about, are there still moments of discrimination and hatred and acts of hatred in our community against the Jewish people? And I'd be glad to hear from you. I think you've spoken to that some. I know
Yeah.
you sent me some articles, which I'm going to share with our congregation as well, just to help see the reality of this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, Reverend Evan, when you sent me that question, it took me about 1 minute on the internet to find a few articles to send you of recent incidents in Chester County. Swastikas being spray painted on buildings, a person wandering around Westchester, with a sign that said, the Jews caused 9/11, or, with COVID, the narrative that, like, certain racial and ethnic groups are less susceptible to COVID, like Jews. There's a presidential candidate who has espoused this falsehood, right? But people believe things. And there have been incidents on the Westchester University campus over the past 4 or 5 years. So, I mean, I guess what I would say is the kinds of things where there's quotas or there's restrictions, like, when I was growing up, my parents wanted to move to a certain town that was the next town over from where we lived, and no Jews, Catholics, or Blacks. Okay, that's how it was in that town. Okay, it's not like that anymore. They did not move to that town. That feels really different to me than real acts of hatred, which we see. And yeah, so anti-Jewish hate is called the oldest hatred for a reason, and it's not going away anytime soon. And if we just look back to the book of Esther, we see how it gets fomented, right? It's like paranoia in the court, paranoia in the seats of power. There's these people, they're not like us. Can we really trust them? Whatever. I mean, that narrative persists. And it's weird because, there's a sort of, like, again, this is something that is really espoused by white supremacists. It's like both, and that Jews are inferior, but somehow they have all this political and economic power. It's like, doesn't really make that much sense, but that's part of the narrative. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I'm so grateful for your time and willingness to share with our congregation and with me, and just to cultivate this friendship and connections we've already made. We've talked a little bit, not in this conversation, about some of the interfaith connections that you've built. And as we think about this moment and this increase in Jewish hate in all over our nation and all over the world, I think these conversations, while aren't going to solve everything, are a helpful step to build more connection and community, and certainly to push away some of that paranoia of people you don't know. It helps to get to know people. But
Absolutely.
I would love to hear how cultivating interfaith dialogue has been a blessing in your life. This is, maybe not something people, in a Protestant congregation expect to hear from a rabbi on a Sunday morning. How is this?
Well, yeah. So I would just say, like, one of the first foundational, interfaith clergy relationships I had was with Reverend Jim Olson, who served your congregation for, I think, 18 or 20 years, a very long time. And uh, at that time I was not a rabbi, but I was still very interested in Judaism. And he shared with me one of his favorite books, which is the book The Sabbath by Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he inscribed it to me, and I still have it and cherish it. And I had read that book many years before. I read it again, and it, like, just the idea that a Baptist minister was going to share with me a book written by like one of the foremost Jewish theologians of the 20th century, that was pretty radical. So I'm very, very grateful for that. Just in my own rabbinate, I would say that interfaith uh, experiences and work are among the most important things that I would say that I have done. Um, in a few areas, uh, with the Sufi Fellowship of Baal Mahayadin, which is based in Philadelphia and in East Fallowfield, out in the farther hinterlands of Chester County, and with a group of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian women having a very intentionally multi-faith Seder before Passover for several years, where we incorporated Jewish, Christian, and Muslim ritual. So, very careful about not falling subject to cultural appropriation, and having a lot of discussion about what does that mean, and what does it mean to learn and have an experience, as opposed to being cultural appropriators. So I think those things are really important. I do think that these sorts of conversations are important in terms of clergy to clergy. And I would say probably even more important is for congregational members to interact, in a multi-faith kind of a setting. And that does feel like it's a very safe thing in Westchester for the most part. Yeah, I just think the more we know each other, the better. My teacher, Reb Zalman, may he rest in peace, he had this expression. He would say, the only way to get together is together. And so I just think that's important to remember.
Yeah, what a phrase. That's going to stick with me. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I have it on bumper sticker on my car. So
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. Well, Rabbi Elyse, I just want to thank you so much for your time, for your friendship, for your willingness to share with us. And if you don't mind, I'd love to ask if you would pray for us and for our community. And by our community, I don't just mean the Baptist Church of Westchester, but for Chester County, Westchester.
sure. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's really my pleasure. And just to say, if your congregants have any other questions or whatever, they can forward them to you and then forward them to me. One thing I just will sort of say that, like, for a lot of reasons, Judaism's been around for a long time, and our interpretations of the Book of Esther have evolved. And, even just, for example, when we talk about Vashti and how we understand her, there's nothing that's like, this is how it is. Okay. So, when I talk about my experiences or what I've learned or whatever, people should just know that I don't speak for all Jews. I speak for just only me. And with not a great deal of authority. I will say that in a very humble way. I know a lot, but I know far from everything. And, if people want to learn more from the sort of Jewish perspectives on the Book of Esther, or on anything, there's a fantastic website that I will tell you about. It's called Sefaria, Sefaria, Sefaria.org. And, will give you links to so many Jewish texts, and you can just press on a place and it will show you commentaries, and some of it is only in Hebrew, but a lot of it is in English, and it's amazing. It's just, I would say, almost to the level of like Gutenberg Bible, like the printing press. This is like the democratization of text access just in the past few years, and they're always adding things. So, if people want to know, because one thing I didn't talk about, and then I promise I will pray. A problem with any kind of text is that if you're working from a translation, you are already missing so many subtleties. And every translation is an interpretation. And Hebrew is a very content dense language in terms of each word. I could talk about this for a long time, but I won't. So like for example, I know this was actually one of the sort of sub questions about this whole idea of like for such a time as this, right? I mean, one of the things that is really important in that little quote, this is like Mordecai trying to get Esther to like talk to the king, even though that would put her in danger. A part that's so missing a lot of times is, that you rose to this royal place for such a time as this. And so, when we talk about that, to me, what that says is, how do we use our power?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, sure, for such a time as this, sure, you could say that about just about everything. But if we say, okay, you are in a position of power at such a time as this, how are you using your power? It has a totally different valence to me than a person who doesn't have power, and I think it asks a different question. Anyway, so Safaria.org, fantastic site. And a site that's similar but not as robust anymore. I think that's a Christian site, Blue Letter Bible. Do you know that site? Yeah, that's it. I like that site a lot too, especially if you're into the Greek part, but it's not so important for me, but I like to look at it. But all the links to the different dictionaries and just I don't know. I'm like a word geek, so I love all that stuff.
Yeah, I couldn't believe until I started studying Hebrew, just the vastness and the humor and all these layers of things. And my Hebrew
Yeah,
is pretty terrible, but even just this learning in school, it opened my eyes to so much nuance and beauty in the text.
yeah. See, and if you have a source like Safaria, your Hebrew doesn't have to be that good. You just have to be able to highlight a word, and then it will bring you to BDB or Jastro or any of those dictionaries that you had in seminary, maybe. And it opens up like just with a click. It's amazing. So anyway, let me get my head together for a prayer. Okay. Misha Berach Avotinu v'Imotinu. May the Holy One of Blessing, who blessed our forefathers and our foremothers, bless this congregation of the First Baptist Church of Westchester and all those who live and work and play in the surrounding communities, to bless all of them with joy. And as it says in the Talmud about Purim, Misha Nichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha, when Adar comes, joy will increase. So to have a sense of joy increasing, to also, as we enter now in this month before our high holidays, the month of Elul, which is an acronym for Ani L'Dodi V'Dodi Li, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. Who is the beloved? The beloved is God. So to feel that we are part of God, God loves us, and we reciprocate. At this time of the year, it's said that God the king is in the field, who can go out and be physically embraced by the presence of God. So we should have these experiences in ways that move us towards justice and righteousness, to a thirst for learning and compassion and caring, and being the very, very best kind of human citizen of Westchester and of the planet. And for all these, let's say amen.
Amen.